Welcome to the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. The Defense Horizon Journal is a professional and academic journal that features essays, reports, and analyses covering geopolitics and law, security and defense policy, peace and conflict studies, applied military science, as well as developments in weapons technology. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org.
Episode number 102. AI, Automation Bias, and the Defense of Clausewitzian Command Judgement. By Amber Britton and Peter Soldart. Introduction. Artificial intelligence, AI, is transforming military command, yet most defense doctrine continues to treat AI primarily as a force multiplier that accelerates planning, expands situational awareness, and improves decision support. This instrumental view assumes that command judgment remains fundamentally unchanged while the quantity and speed of available information increase. This article argues instead that AI reconstitutes rather than merely augments command judgment by progressively altering the conditions under which judgment is formed and exercised. Clausewitz recognized that war cannot be reduced to technical calculation. It remains an act of policy, in which the political object is the goal, war is the means of reaching it, and means can never be considered in isolation from their purpose. The commander's essential task is therefore not simply to process information more efficiently, but to exercise judgment under conditions of uncertainty, friction, and incomplete knowledge. Central to this capacity is what Clausewitz termed coup cultivated, the cultivated ability to synthesize complex and ambiguous situations into decisive action. Although often associated with military genius, coup cultivated is not merely exercised in command, it is developed through education, operational experience, and the repeated practice of independent judgment. AI places systematic pressure on this faculty through three mutually reinforcing pathologies. The first is automation bias, whereby repeated deference to algorithmic recommendation substitutes compliance for independent judgment. The second is algorithmic monoculture, through which common AI architectures reduce the cognitive diversity necessary to recognize novelty, deception, and strategic surprise. The third is delegated infopolitik, whereby consequential political and ethical choices become embedded within AI systems, obscuring their provenance and weakening the accountability that Clausewitz regarded as essential to war as an instrument of policy. These developments suggest that the principal challenge posed by AI is not whether machines can make better operational recommendations than humans in particular contexts. It is whether sustained reliance upon AI alters the development and exercise of the human judgment on which command ultimately depends. The question is therefore as much pedagogical and doctrinal as technological. The inward eye under siege. Automation bias has a precise clinical definition: the tendency of human operators to defer to automated recommendations even when those recommendations are demonstrably wrong. A 2024 systematic review and meta-analysis confirmed that human-AI combinations can outperform humans alone, but this benefit is conditional. It degrades the moment operators accept AI outputs without active verification. In high-stakes operational environments, empirical research indicates that humans accept automated recommendations between 60 and 80% of the time, even when those recommendations are demonstrably incorrect. Automation bias is not a momentary lapse in judgment. It is habituated compliance, applied systematically across every decision cycle, in which a commander accepts, without active scrutiny, what an algorithm has already decided. The intelligence under attack is specific. Clausewitz, in On War, termed it coup cultivated, the commander's inward eye, the rapid discovery of a truth which to the ordinary mind is either not visible at all or only becomes so after long examination and reflection. It is not only the physical, but more frequently the mental eye. In the darkest hours of war, amid friction, fog, and uncertainty, the commander requires an intellect that retains some glimmering of inner light which leads to truth, which must then be followed with determination. Coup cultivated, or operational discernment, is more than tactical acuity. It is the capacity for synthesis, the holistic, intuitive recognition of the decisive point and the moment for action, that makes command possible when data are incomplete, contradictory, or actively deceptive. Clausewitz emphasized that this intelligence, while containing an element of innate talent, is cultivated through experience, education, and the repeated exercise of judgment under conditions of uncertainty, a point Frederick the Great anticipated operationally, warning that its absence produces errors of the greatest consequence. Modern cognitive research on expert decision-making closely parallels this account. Klein's recognition primed decision (RPD) model establishes that an experienced commander does not enumerate options analytically under pressure. Drawing on accumulated pattern recognition, they identify the situation as sufficiently familiar to generate a workable course of action, run it mentally to check for problems, and act or adjust. This generative, self-correcting process, not analytical comparison, is the cognitive signature of genuine expertise under time pressure. A commander who habitually defers to algorithmic recommendations practices deference, not synthesis. The inward eye, unused, dims. Clausewitz identified this genius as rare and not imitable. Education and training alone do not yield brilliant command, it is the careful cultivation of intellectual and psychological attributes, specifically intuition, creativity, and resilience, developed through deliberate formation and sustained experience that produces exceptional command outcomes. Automation bias reaches further than inconveniencing commanders who already possess command intuition. It removes the conditions under which the capacity can develop at all. Two reinforcing processes drive the erosion. Automation bias describes over-reliance on a capability that remains intact. Desk killing, in Bainbridge's foundational analysis, describes its atrophy. When operators are removed from active decision-making, the competence required to intervene if the system fails does not merely go unused, it disappears. The two compounds, automation bias reduces the occasions on which coup d'oeil is exercised, desk killing reduces the faculty itself, leaving a commander who has deferred for a career without either the habit or the underlying architecture at exactly the moment both are required. Cognitive science establishes that expert pattern recognition, whether in chess, surgery, or command, is maintained through deliberate practice under conditions of genuine uncertainty and degrades through routines that substitute procedural compliance for judgment. Recent experimental evidence adds nuance to the formation question. Lushenko and Sparrow's survey experiment among ROK cadets, which provides the first experimental evidence of cadets' trust in AI-enhanced military technologies, found that cadets are more trusting of AI than senior officers, but that their trust reflects a more conservative understanding of appropriate use and oversight, shaped by professional enculturation alongside ongoing cognitive and moral development. Kahn, Horowitz, and Sametin's subsequent West Point study found that cadets display significantly lower susceptibility to automation bias and better calibrated trust in algorithmic decision support than demographically similar civilians. Formation, then, develops more thoughtful oversight habits than the general population, and operational experience builds deeper skepticism still, consistent with the argument that the inward eye is cultivated through years of practice, not only in academy classrooms. One counterargument deserves direct acknowledgement. Johnson, 2023, contends that AI integration may, counterintuitively, increase the importance of human decision makers. As systems become more capable, the quality of the command reasoning that governs them becomes more consequential, not less. This article accepts that proposition and extends it. Johnson identifies what is at stake in AI-augmented command. This article identifies the mechanism by which the inward eye on which that stake depends is formed and lost. This pattern recurs across levels of war. At Kiev, Ukrainian units repelled Russia's advance with improvisational clarity no algorithm could have anticipated. At the political strategic level, Western policymakers and Putin alike misread Zelensky's psychobiographical character, exposing the limits of frameworks unable to interpret singular human agency. And at the tactical level, 8 Marines defeated a 2019 DARPA computer vision system using tactics no training dataset anticipated, among them disguising themselves as trees. In each case, formulaic or algorithmic anticipation failed precisely where abductive, improvisational human reasoning succeeded. AI excels at rapidly processing large volumes of data for target identification, prioritization, and tactical simulation in current combat operations. However, the creation of operational design and the broader concept of operations, encompassing the integration of political objectives, the sequencing of effects across domains, and the exercise of judgment under conditions of radical uncertainty, remain fundamentally human, abductive tasks. Dario Amodi, CEO of Anthropic, which held the primary contract to deploy Claude on classified DAO networks, grounded this assessment in the technology's demonstrated limitations. His formal position was direct: Without proper oversight, fully autonomous weapons cannot be relied upon to exercise the critical judgment that our highly trained, professional troops exhibit every day. In subsequent testimony, he was more specific still. It doesn't show the judgment that a human soldier would show, friendly fire or shooting a civilian, or just the wrong kind of thing. We don't want to sell something that we don't think is reliable. Current systems can augment and accelerate elements of planning but do not supplant the commander's integrative synthesis of passion, reason, and chance. Algorithmic monoculture and the fragility of Allied command. This erosion does not stop at the individual level. When it operates across an alliance that shares the same algorithmic architectures, a second pathology compounds it, algorithmic monoculture. The US has been the dominant architect of Allied networked security, and the Joint Intelligence, Surveillance and Reconnaissance (JISR) network and Project Maven's machine learning targeting now underpin command decisions across multiple Allied headquarters, creating structural efficiency and, in the same stroke, structural fragility. A single shared way of knowing and interpreting the battlefield is also a single point of failure. Military organizations periodically reconstitute their cognitive foundations around the dominant paradigm of their era, and today's algorithmic architectures were built for permissive environments, stable connectivity, single-truth data integrity, reliable infrastructure. Soldat's own empirical fieldwork during NATO exercises documents what happens when these assumptions meet the non-permissive theater, where each fails. The accelerating pace of AI-assisted decision-making has been confirmed at the highest levels of NATO command. Admiral Pierre Vandier, NATO Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, confirmed in 2025 that alliance members are now using AI in the decision-making loop of observe, orient, decide and act, with analysis that once took hours or days, now done in a matter of seconds. This risk is structural to the alliance, not specific to American command. NATO's 2021 AI Principles and the UK's 2023 Defence Command Paper both commit member states to the same architectural interoperability that generates monoculture risk. When every major headquarters interprets the battlefield through the same algorithmic lens, built on the same design assumptions, optimized against the same training data, operating on the same architecture, the conditions for genuine strategic dissent disappear. Reynolds's 2025 analysis of temporal compression confirms the mechanism. As AI shortens decision cycles, the window for human contestation of machine consensus contracts, making monoculture most dangerous precisely when correction is most urgent. The operational scale of this integration is no longer notional. General Eric Kurilla, commander of U.S. Central Command during the 2025 bombing campaign against Iran, testified that his command had built a system that allowed us to dynamically prosecute over 1,000 targets every 24 hours, with the capacity to do even more. At such processing velocities, the window in which a human commander can contest, interrogate, or override a machine recommendation has become exceedingly narrow, a structural condition that monoculture renders maximally dangerous. This monocultural pull is reinforced by a deeper civilizational imaginary. As Neil Rennick, 2026, argues, Western military technology has long been framed as the embodiment of civilized warfare, understood to be precise, restrained, and morally superior. This imaginary creates powerful cultural and institutional incentives to embrace common architectures, even when doing so concentrates risk and reduces cognitive diversity across allied forces. Algorithmic monoculture fails differently from ordinary intelligence failure, where flawed analysis is eventually corrected by competing assessments, dissenting analysts, or the friction of events. In this context, three properties of normal error correction disappear at once. The error is synchronous, with every affected headquarters reaching the same wrong assessment simultaneously and no temporal offset left for one actor to catch another's mistake. It is internally invisible, since no actor sees a different picture to dissent from, and it concentrates precisely where independent reassessment is most needed, in the novel and deceptive conditions where training data is least representative and monoculture ensures human judgment is least available. The formal result supporting this analysis is established in complexity science. Cognitively diverse groups demonstrably outperform homogeneous high-ability groups on novel problems, the category that monoculture is least equipped to handle. On any battlefield, as the author's experience from NATO exercises confirms and as documented operational patterns establish, roughly 50% of information arrives too late, and 25% is false, induced by the enemy, inaccurate reporting, or rumor. A commander must therefore develop an intuitive feel for what information is reliable and what must be discarded. They must sense when something anomalous suggests enemy deception. An AI cannot reliably make this distinction. It is rapidly poisoned or misled by environmental noise, adversary deception, or the simple absence of precedent in its training data for the condition it is being asked to evaluate. The invisible political choice. The third pathology has a precise conceptual antecedent. De Gouvier and Plumridge's concept of infopolitik, understood as the shaping of information environments through which other actors must operate, finds its contemporary parallel in the architecture of AI targeting systems. The extension is not analogical, it is structural. AI targeting and recommendation models do not just process reality, they constitute it. The datasets on which they are trained, the objectives for which they are optimized, and the thresholds at which they generate recommendations are all political choices. Those choices are typically invisible to the commander who acts on their outputs. Clausewitz's insistence that officers gather information and interpret it correctly, filtering cognitive noise, rumor, and misinformation, applies here with particular force. A commander who cannot scrutinize an AI recommendation's data lineage is navigating a fog of their own making. The same mechanism governs command structures when AI constitutes the decisional frame, posing concerns a principal-agent analysis cannot adequately capture. That framework describes deviation from intent once intent is formed, while infopolitik operates at a prior level, shaping the epistemic conditions under which the principal forms intent in the first place. The commander who acts on an AI recommendation is not unaware that political choices have shaped it. She is unaware of what those choices were, who made them, and on what basis. This accountability gap has an established literature in the autonomous weapons debate. Sparrow's responsibility gap, the argument that when a machine selects a target, moral responsibility falls between the programmer, the commander, and the system itself, identifies the same structural problem this article analyses under this infopolitik. Unlike a landmine, which executes a human's prior decision without judgment of its own, an AI targeting system performs an inferential act of classification and recommendation that more closely resembles delegated judgment than a mechanical trigger. The resulting gap arises from this judgment-like function rather than technological complexity alone, locating accountability more precisely in the prior constitutive architecture than in the moment of lethal execution, political choices embedded before the commander ever acts, and therefore difficult to contest. Delegated infopolitik is most consequential when the AI system constituting the decisional frame has been deployed through an intermediary arrangement that structurally prevents the primary developer from exercising oversight of its own technology, particularly when that architecture spans multiple combatant commands. The Anthropic Department of War dispute of February-March 2026 offers the most fully documented contemporary case of this condition, not because the structural problem is American, but because the dispute's public record is unusually complete. Any state procuring military AI through an intermediary architecture it does not control faces the same constitutive risk. Its analytical value lies in what it reveals about how infopolitik becomes structurally embedded in military AI, contracting arrangements whose opacity is a design feature, intermediary organizations whose institutional loyalties run to government clients over technology vendors, and an accountability chain so attenuated that the primary vendor learned of its technology's operational use through media reporting rather than direct disclosure. Anthropic held a $200 million contract to deploy Claude across classified DAO networks via Palantir's AIP platform, an arrangement that structurally insulated Anthropic from visibility into specific operational uses. In February 2026, reports indicated Claude had been deployed during the operation that captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, exceeding the pre-operational planning scope the contract contemplated. When an Anthropic executive's inquiry about this was relayed to the Pentagon, the DAO read it as vendor disapproval of a military success and, citing Anthropic's refusal to remove exclusions on autonomous lethal weapons and mass surveillance, designated the company a supply chain risk. Amodi's response named the structural paradox directly: we do not believe that it is the role of Anthropic or any private company to be involved in operational decision-making. Confirmation came from within the DAO itself when, reviewing inherited contracts, Under-Secretary Emil Michael found AI systems baked into some of the most sensitive and important places in the US military, without being visible to incoming leadership. The embedded capability itself constituted a structural power, in strange sense, that no political designation could dislodge. What the Anthropic case demonstrates in miniature is the same structural condition already visible at the alliance level, a vendor relationship in which the political choices governing lethal force are made by parties outside the chain of command, with the state discovering the architecture's limits only after the fact. Western governance frameworks have attempted to codify this requirement. The United States .3000.09, for instance, mandates appropriate levels of human judgment over the use of force, language not unique to AI, since commanders have always exercised graduated judgment under ambiguous orders, though it is now the vendor, not the commander, who sets the threshold. The resulting accountability problem is corporate, regulatory, and doctrinal at once, compounded by international humanitarian law's continued failure to adapt to AI in the loop targeting. The problem is not only doctrinal and legal, it is, at its deepest level, cognitive and political. The agent-actor framework developed by Hudson and Day provides a useful diagnostic instrument here. When a commander approves an AI-generated recommendation derived from unrepresentative training data, the connection between motives, values, and objectives is severed. Moral agency is delegated to an opaque process. Accountability, in legal, political, and ethical terms, becomes impossible to assign. AI-mediated error need not differ in kind from error introduced by flawed human intelligence. A commander who acts on either retains accountability for the decision. What differs is scale and traceability. A flawed intelligence report can be traced to a named source and a documented chain of judgment, while the political and technical choices embedded in an AI system's design are made by parties absent from the operational chain of command, often before the unit deploying the system exists. That a sitting Secretary of War felt compelled to assure Congress, mid-campaign, that humans are kept in the loop when artificial intelligence is involved in military decisions, an assurance promptly repeated by the Joint Chiefs Chairman, illustrates the disparity between formal commitment and operational reality. This article identifies the disparity Wallace's modeling helps explain. Speed-optimized systems are structurally poorly suited to the kind of accountability such assurances promise. The Clausewitzian trinity in the algorithmic age. Each pathology targets a different element of the same Clausewitzian structure, operating at the individual, alliance, and systemic levels respectively. Mapping their interaction within the trinity reveals both the threat's coherence and what a counter-strategy must address. Clausewitz's trinity remains the most robust conceptual architecture for understanding war as a human and political phenomenon. This article's position, argued against the revisionist view, is that the trinity already describes cognitive warfare. What contemporary theorists name as a new domain is the systematic targeting of the moral forces, friction, and passion that Clausewitz identified as the essential character of war 2 centuries ago. The trinity needs no adaptation for the algorithmic age. It needs to be read more carefully. The commander's inward eye is the operational microcosm of the trinity itself. When automation bias, algorithmic monoculture, and delegated infopolitik eroded, both the capacity to conduct cognitive operations effectively and the resilience to withstand adversary cognitive attacks are compromised. Clausewitz's analysis ranged from individual commanders to the totality of national power. Geography, alliances, and material resources all enter his strategic reckoning. He consistently argued that while material and numerical superiority are necessary conditions, the moral factors, encompassing quality of leadership, troop morale, and national spirit, can prove decisive against superior material odds. Automation bias works against precisely these moral factors, consistent with the desk-killing mechanism described above. Sustained deference dulls the will to act independently and habituates the commander to defer rather than to lead. At the strategic level, what is now termed cognitive warfare operates upon the moral forces and perceptual structures that Clausewitz identified as central to war's outcome, making it a Clausewitzian phenomenon in new technological clothing rather than a distinct strategic domain. Schmeidel, 2026, and Brittenhale, 2023, both confirm this continuity directly. Their analyses of cognitive warfare are, at root, applications of the trinity to contemporary conditions. Hunter and Bowen, 2024, underscore that war's fundamental logic is abductive. It demands creative inference under radical uncertainty. Machine learning systems, by contrast, operate inductively on historical patterns. The mismatch is ontological. Machine learning systems are designed to identify regularities across a domain of similar past cases and extrapolate their patterns to new instances of the same class, coup is the faculty required for the singular event that has no precedent to recognize. This is not a difference in processing speed or data volume. It is a difference in the kind of object being reasoned about. The algorithm operates on a population of instances. The commander must act on a singular event. Clausewitz understood, from his study of the Napoleonic Wars, that a totality of context and information can only be grasped in retrospect, its significance visible after the fact rather than in the moment of decision. AI systems share this constraint but cannot reliably compensate for it. Their inductive processing is bounded by what was captured during training, not by what will matter when the engagement is decided. A human commander can at least sense that the situation is new. An AI cannot know what it does not know. When commanders are encouraged or required to defer to inductive outputs, the abductive core of contextual synthesis atrophies. Command in the algorithmic age. As the present article's co-author, in his capacity as NATO's AJP-3 custodian, has observed, with AI, an army becomes a sharper tool. How that tool is used remains a human responsibility, subject to human judgment and decision. Formation operates at two levels, preserving both the cognitive conditions under which autonomous assessment remains possible and the accountability chain that makes commanders' judgments documented, contestable, and exercised by officers capable of independent assessment when the AI architecture fails or misleads. Clausewitz cautioned that blind adherence to theory, producing rigidity of response, is fraught in the variable environment of war, which encompasses human emotion, chance events, and the unpredictable actions of the enemy. A doctrine that mandates nominal oversight without cultivating the discernment to exercise it commits precisely the error Clausewitz identified. Boldness, presence of mind, and intelligence cannot be feigned. In modern military decision-making, resolution, boldness, and daring risk are quietly being diluted by conformity to algorithmic consensus, with no single moment marking the loss. The three mechanisms proposed here are not a refinement of standard human oversight requirements. Every AI governance framework, from NATO's 2021 AI Principles to DOD 3000.09, mandates human approval of AI outputs, yet none has prevented the accountability failure this paper documents. Nominal oversight, a human signature on an AI-generated recommendation, preserves the form of accountability while eliminating its substance. They are designed to preserve the human's actual capacity for judgment, not just their formal presence in the process. That is a formational task, not a governance one. Coup is not a procedure that can be mandated or a threshold that can be enforced by directive. It is, as Klein's research on expert decision-making establishes, a form of embodied professional knowledge acquired through sustained deliberate practice under conditions of genuine uncertainty, conditions in which the practitioner receives feedback that builds, tests, and refines pattern recognition over time. No governance framework can mandate that a human be capable of genuine judgment at a decision point. It can only mandate that a human be present. The difference between presence and capability is built, or not built, in the years of formation before the commander ever encounters an AI-supported command environment. The three mechanisms that follow are formational practices rather than constraints on AI systems, each targeting a different level of the threat. Narrative audits target automation bias at the point of individual command decision, cognitive red teaming targets monoculture at the level of collective alliance intelligence, and bias-logged records with analog fallback target delegated infopolitik at the level of systemic epistemic architecture. This convergence between cognitive attack resilience and automation bias resistance at the level of officer formation is confirmed by concurrent work in this journal. Shuliok, Grangel, and Gruber argue that cognitive warfare's decisive vulnerabilities are epistemological, requiring the same shift from procedural compliance to adaptive reasoning that this article proposes as the defense against AI-induced desk killing. Command as accountable record. Commanders already provide formal rationale during the problem analysis phase of planning and in the commander's assessment section of an operations plan, explaining why they accept or reject particular facts and assumptions. The narrative audit extends this established practice specifically to AI-influenced decisions. Commanders must provide a formal, documented rationale whenever they accept, modify, or deviate from an AI recommendation of consequence. This converts judgment from an implicit act into an auditable record, preserving the motives values objectives chain that Clausewitz identifies as the non-negotiable link between political ends and military means, while generating an institutional corpus for evaluating human-machine decision dynamics over time. The audit record is not merely institutional memory, it is the evidentiary foundation of political accountability, the documentation that makes a commander's exercise of sovereign assessment traceable to the chain of civilian authority that war as an act of policy requires. The principal objection to narrative audits in operational settings is the aggregate volume of AI-influenced decisions across the command structure. General Kirilla's account of processing over 1,000 targets per day, even when distributed across staff at every echelon, illustrates a throughput that leaves no institutional capacity for individual real-time justification. The audit requirement is therefore not proposed as a real-time procedure but as a formation practice and a post-event institutional record, building on existing mechanisms such as nightly commander interviews by the war diarist or embedded historian. Its primary purpose is not to slow individual decisions but to create, over time, an institutional corpus that makes the patterns of human-machine interaction visible. Nuclear release authorization protocols provide the established precedent. The documentation burden is proportionate to consequence, not to tempo. Clausewitz's insistence on the historiography of military campaigns as the instrument for developing command intelligence retains its full force here. AI now enables historical examples, past stratagems, and wargame outcomes to be processed and compared instantaneously, with predictive models applied to modern scenarios. This is a legitimate and bounded role for AI in command education, accelerating the processing of historical patterns while recognizing that any such corpus reflects the selection biases of what was documented and what was taught. The development of command discernment, however, remains the practitioner's own task. The narrative audit is how that practice is documented. In officer formation, this practice must be trained, not assumed. Cadets require structured exposure to decision scenarios in which they must articulate the reasoning behind their departures from algorithmic consensus. Cognitive red teaming. The Prussian-German tradition of Auftragstaktik, the tradition of mission command, was designed to develop commanders capable of exercising independent judgment at the edge of the network. In an algorithmic age, this principle must be explicitly extended. While red teaming already exists to counter conventional groupthink, the perceived infallibility of algorithmic outputs creates a more seductive and harder to challenge form of consensus. Standing dissenter roles should therefore be institutionalized with the specific mandate to challenge machine consensus and reintroduce the healthy friction of human strategic debate. The principal objection to institutionalized dissenter roles is cultural. Military organizations reward decisiveness and may interpret documented hesitation as unreliability. This objection confirms rather than undermines the argument. If the culture currently penalizes the cognitive habits that mission command requires, including independent assessment, willingness to diverge from consensus, and moral courage under conditions of certainty pressure, then the culture itself, rather than the mechanism, is the problem. The standing dissenter role is not merely a procedural intervention, it is a cultural signal that contesting machine consensus constitutes an exercise of command authority rather than a deviation from it. Using the command leadership management framework developed by Hofstetter, Geller, and Gester, 2025, this reform works across three levels: doctrine, formalizing contestation procedures in C2 processes; culture, forming the habit of challenge before deployment; and management, institutionalizing the standing dissenter role as a staff function with defined accountability. Simonetti and Tripodi, 2020, identified this risk directly, that technological acceleration produces systemic over-centralization of command through the path of least resistance when no formation has built the counter-habit. Van der Griff's observation that mission command culture cannot be built in the hot state applies with equal force here. This role must be modeled by senior officers before deployment, not introduced as a crisis response. The British Army's leadership doctrine articulates an equivalent formation imperative, requiring that commanders at all levels be capable of acting on understood intent without direct orders, a standard that this article argues must be extended, in the algorithmic age, to the capacity to act without algorithmic consensus. Officers must be educated, trained, and experienced enough to override AI when necessary, knowing two levels up and down, capable of the cognitive wargaming Boyd describes in Patterns of Conflict, as the key to Auftragstaktik superiority, operating inside the adversary's decision cycle by anticipating their next move before they have made it. Accountability and operational resilience. Every AI-generated recommendation of operational consequence should carry embedded provenance traces, training data sources, optimization objectives, confidence intervals, and known dataset limitations. Such records provide commanders with the epistemic transparency necessary to exercise substantive rather than merely nominal assessment, while preserving the accountability chain linking political authority to military action. Communications infrastructure in non-permissive environments cannot be assumed. Digital systems emit detectable electrical and thermal signatures, command posts, therefore, become targets. The author's operational experience from NATO exercises confirms this directly. During an exercise in Norway, satellite dishes were pointed into the ground due to horizon constraints, radio signals were attenuated by wet forest terrain, and command posts reverted to motorcycles and USB sticks to transmit messages. Analog fallback doctrine is therefore not a nostalgic redundancy but a standing operational requirement for continuity of command under degraded conditions. Officer formation must accordingly cultivate what this article terms digital analog fluidity, the trained capacity to sustain command effectiveness when AI systems are unavailable, compromised, degraded, or deliberately denied. Modi stated explicitly that operational decisions belong to the military rather than to private companies. This was both a statement of principle and an acknowledgement that the boundary between operational authority and commercial system architecture had not, in practice, been securely established. In the absence of officers capable of evaluating, contesting, and governing AI recommendations, the commercial and political assumptions embedded by those who build the systems will inevitably fill the vacuum. Consistent with the sharper tool framing established earlier, AI accelerates warfare subprocesses, particularly where human reaction times are insufficient. Yet the design and direction of operations remain fundamentally human responsibilities because war incorporates political reasoning, moral consequence, ambiguity, deception, and contextual interpretation in ways no integrated cross-process automation can fully reconcile. This reality carries institutional implications for officer education. Commanders must be formed in military staff colleges oriented towards strategic and operational reasoning rather than educated primarily through civilian-derived management techniques, as increasingly occurs in contemporary professional military education. The issue is not technical proficiency alone but the preservation of the inward eye, the capacity for independent synthesis amid uncertainty and friction. Preserving the inward eye is therefore the central pedagogical task of officer formation in the algorithmic age. The United States FY 2027 defense budget hearings, conducted alongside ongoing operations in Iran, underscored both the operational promise of AI-enabled autonomy and the continuing requirement for human decisional authority in lethal decisions. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth's assurance that humans are kept in the loop, offered in response to questioning regarding civilian casualties, simultaneously revealed the disparity between doctrinal commitment and institutional formation. The loop can only hold if commanders possess the cognitive authority, moral architecture, and operational confidence necessary to exercise sovereign discernment within it. Commanders must be exercised repeatedly in scenarios where AI outputs are incomplete, misleading, or operationally misaligned, so that the inward eye remains the final arbiter rather than the default deferrer. Human discernment can endure under extreme cognitive and kinetic pressure. The architectural and pedagogical task is to ensure that it remains possible when the pressure originates not only from the enemy but from allied AI systems themselves. Conclusion. Coup d'oeil does not survive neglect. Automation bias removes the practice through which it develops, algorithmic monoculture removes the diversity through which its failures become visible, delegated infopolitik removes the accountability that makes preserving it a political necessity. A doctrine that treats AI as a neutral accelerant produces only the appearance of command. The remedy is formational rather than technological. Narrative audits, cognitive red teaming, and analog fallback preserve the conditions under which sovereign judgment remains possible. They are not adjuncts to officer education but its central purpose. The choice is institutional. Western defense establishments can permit algorithmic architectures to reconstitute command judgment through incremental and largely invisible shifts in practice, or they can reaffirm the Clausewitzian principle that war remains an act of policy, directed by human beings who bear responsibility for its moral and political consequences. AI may accelerate analysis, but it cannot assume that responsibility. The wars of the algorithmic age will still be decided by the commander's inward eye. Whether that eye remains capable of discerning the decisive moment will depend less on the sophistication of the machine than on the quality of the officers entrusted to govern it. The authors, Dr. Amber Britton Hale is a director of strategic research, Intelligence and Policy Research Fellow, an adjunct professor of global affairs and leadership. She holds a PhD in global leadership and change. Her research examines the role of leadership, agency, and strategic decision-making in international affairs. Her current work examines diplomacy, foreign policy analysis, and leadership decision-making in high-stakes environments. Lieutenant Colonel Peter Soldaat, RETD, served in the Royal Netherlands Army and was J5, Planning, in RC South Afghanistan and G5 in the NATO Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, VJTF. He holds a Master of Arts in Military History from the University of Amsterdam. His published research on the re-strategizing of military digitalization, including empirical fieldwork from NATO exercises, has appeared in Air and Space Operations Review. He is currently the custodian for NATO's Allied Joint Doctrine for Operations, AJP 3. The views contained in this article are the author's alone and do not represent the views of any organization, such as the Netherlands Ministry of Defense or NATO.
This was the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org. Thank you for listening.